Here are the nominees for Best Independent Game: Cult of the Lamb, Neon White, Sifu, Stray, Tunic, and the Game Award goes to Stray. Congratulations.
Hello and welcome to a video I should have made a month ago. But hey, better late than never, right? In case you missed it, the 2022 Game Awards were last month, and the category that I was most invested in is Best Indie Game. Now, I don't take awards shows too seriously, but it's a good excuse to talk about some of the most popular and acclaimed indie games of last year, and if it gets people excited about trying something new, I think that's great. I did play all 5 nominees in advance, and I definitely had a favorite, so in this video I'm going to briefly review all 5 games in order of release, and then rank all 5 at the end. In case you missed it, those games are Sifu, Tunic, Neon White, Stray, and Cult of the Lamb. And there will be some spoilers for all of these games, so if you care about that, go play them first and come back. If you enjoy this one, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and if you played any or all of these games, let me know in the comments what you thought of them. First up is Sifu, the Kung Fu revenge beat-em-up from French developer Slowclap. Sifu was released in February on PlayStation and PC, with later releases for Xbox and Switch, and I actually really like this one. For one thing, the story is really solid and well integrated into the gameplay. Sifu follows a young man, or woman, who witnesses the death of his kung fu master father and sets out to get revenge on the gang of rogue martial artists that murdered their former teacher. This involves tracking the former students down through slums, nightclubs, museums, or office complexes, and facing them one-on-one in kung fu showdowns. There's a little more to the story than first meets the eye, and some of the endgame content involves reevaluating your father's legacy, the nature of revenge, and the true meaning of kung fu, which I like. The thing that everyone associates with Sifu, which was also key to the game's marketing, is the central gimmick that the protagonist ages with every death. So your character possesses a magical medallion that lets you temporarily defy death, and every time you would be killed, you instead age a few years. The amount of years you age on each death goes up each time, but you can bring it back down with enough successful takedowns. As you age, your appearance changes, and so do some of your other attributes. With age, you become more fragile, but also deliver more deadly and damaging strikes, presumably due to a lengthening lifetime of mastery. The ultimate goal is to hunt down and confront all 5 antagonists in the game over the course of a single lifetime, which is not that easy because the combat and especially the boss fights in Sifu are pretty tough. Let's talk about the combat. The combat in Sifu is combo-based with dodges, blocks, and a stance meter that causes you to lose your balance and potentially take major damage when it fills up. You can likewise fill enemies' stance meters by blocking or by executing certain attacks, and whenever the meter fills up, you can perform an instant finisher. In most cases, you're fighting hordes of enemies rather than single opponents, and you can use parts of the environment as cover, improvised weapons, or anvils to smash enemies' heads against. That all works for me, as I generally like mobs more than boss fights. The devs said that they wanted the player to feel like Jackie Chan, in the way that he's always incorporating everything around him into his fights, and I think they achieved a measure of that. The 5 boss fights are imaginative and visually stunning, but not really my favorite parts of the game. If I had one major complaint, it's that some of the bosses in Sifu are too damage spongy, and the fights go on too long. A couple bosses felt like they kept taking forever, even after I'd figured them out completely, and you do end up having to fight them multiple times, so meh. Anyway, Sifu also looks awesome. The art style is stylized and slightly geometric, and the environments are striking and varied, with elements of magical realism waiting to be uncovered. There's a ton of different kung fu combos, and the action looks a lot less generic than most beat-em-up type games. You can tell they really went the extra mile to capture the fluidity and energy behind the martial arts in the game, and it paid off. I had a great time with Sifu, and if any of that sounded cool, you probably would too. Next, Tunic. Tunic released in March for Xbox and PC, but was ported to PlayStation and Switch in September. I went into this one with possibly the least amount of curiosity, because, it's basically a Zelda game. I figured it couldn't be bad, but it would probably fade into the background of action-adventure Zelda clones. And maybe this is weird on my part, but I tend to be sort of skeptical of games with amazing visuals, because I get suspicious that maybe the visuals were the only reason people loved the game, and maybe the gameplay is not all that good. And Tunic does indeed look incredible, with its geometric toy box landscapes, sharp and striking color palette, and silky smooth animations. However, I'm happy to report that not only is Tunic a joy to play, it also contains elements that really set it apart from other games in the same space. In Tunic, you play as a fox with a sword, on a quest to do something or other. A big part of this game is the total lack of direction or hand-holding, so if that's not your cup of tea, Tunic might not be for you. Nevertheless, there is a story, and in true Zelda fashion, you'll have to fight and puzzle your way through several themed areas, and emerge victorious from a number of epic boss fights. The best and most special part of Tunic is the in-game manual, the pages of which are scattered across the ruined kingdom, waiting to be collected. This is the most blatant homage to the original Legend of Zelda, as well as other NES-era games, as whenever you open the manual, the camera pulls back to reveal Tunic being played on a CRT, with the manual in the foreground. Besides looking incredible, the manual is also the source of all information in the game, including the backstory and lore, lists of items and descriptions of what they do and where to find them, and sometimes an aha moment where you learn about an ability you've actually been able to do the whole time, but never thought of trying. You discover the pages all out of order, and the steady drip of information kept piquing my curiosity to explore somewhere new. And Tunic thoroughly rewards exploration. There are items and upgrades to discover, like a fire rod, hookshot, and ice dagger, cards that modify your weapons in combat, stat upgrades, potions, explosives, decoys, and dozens of collectibles like fairies and secret treasures. Sometimes I'd arrive at a place and immediately think, hey, I recognize this place from the manual. And even if it took me a bit to puzzle out what to do there, I'd feel sure that this spot was somehow meaningful. That brings me to the other best thing about Tunic, which is the world itself. The world continuously reveals itself to be deeper and craftier and more full of secrets than at first it seems. The isometric landscape hides dozens, maybe hundreds of secret passageways and shortcuts and hidden chambers that feel almost impossible to discover without the right clues or the proper perspective. And by the end of the game, the world feels more and more like a massive puzzle, with truly devious solutions that require screenshots and note-taking and translation and more. Sometimes this kind of thing can become tedious, but in Tunic, I never lost interest, and I attribute that mainly to the wonderful manual. If I had any complaints about Tunic, I guess maybe the combat won't be to everyone's liking. The stamina bar can be a bit annoying to keep in mind, and without serious upgrades, you can't use much magic. But I generally felt that the enemy design made up for some of those shortcomings. Also, if you don't like feeling lost and unsure of where to go in a game, that might be a problem for you. But if you do like that element, Tunic does it better than most. Neither of these issues bring the game down for me, and Tunic is one of the best games I've played in a while. Next up is Neon White, which released in June for the Switch and PC, and later released on the PlayStation. This is probably the most unique and original of the 5 nominees, and I had a lot of fun with this one. It's about a yearly competition in which a bunch of degenerate souls from hell, called Neons, are brought to heaven to exterminate loose demons, in exchange for a limited stay on the streets of gold. Half the game is an anime-inspired visual novel that actually stars some really prolific voice actors like Steve Bloom, and the other half is all about super fast-paced first-person shooter speedrunning challenges. I'm not gonna lie, this is one of those games where the story and the gameplay feel like two completely separate games, and while I enjoyed both halves, it did sort of feel like whichever thing I was doing kept being interrupted by the other thing. Nevertheless, the story and the gameplay are both good, and I'll talk about the story first. Neon White, the protagonist, not the game itself, is the deceased amnesiac former member of a gang of criminals, all named after different colors.
Yeah, that's easy for you to say. You're Mr. White. You have a cool-sounding name. All right, look, if it's no big deal to be Mr. Pink, you want to trade?
Neon White is the only member of the gang with no memory of life on Earth, and the rest of the crew play coy with the details at first, but by completing optional challenges, you can build your relationship with each one, as well as some of the other angelic beings, like the cigar-smoking cat angel Mikey, and learn more about your own history. There's also a crazy story going on with Literal God, so you can check out what he's been up to, and it's pretty good. There's some good twists and some good dialogue. I would not play this for the story alone, but I enjoyed it while it was happening. The reason I would play Neon White is for the addicting, one more level, speedrunning gameplay loop. Instead of actual guns per se, Neon White has you pick up cards that function as temporary firearms, but can also be expended for one-time effects like double jumping, ground pounding, or hookshotting. Each level is populated with some demons, and your job is to mow them all down and dash to the exit within the time limit. To achieve the tougher gold and ace medals, which are required for progression and 100% completion respectively, you'll have to be practically inch perfect with your run, which might require dozens of practice attempts. When you catch on, the flow of this game feels really smooth and satisfying. I think the game really hits the sweet spot in terms of difficulty, and after you master a stage, it really makes you feel like your reflexes are next level.
I'm the only human who can do it.
I only have 2 real complaints about Neon White. One is that the story and gameplay feel disjointed, as I said earlier, and the other is that the level design feels a little less interesting in the later parts of the game. What I mean is that many of the earlier levels felt like you could approach them in a dozen different ways, and the speedrunning had a real puzzle element to it. But some of the later levels are a lot longer and more linear, and feel like there is one very specific way you are intended to run them. I'm sure there's some creative sequence breaking out there, but I just felt a lot more pigeonholed in the later levels. Either way, these complaints are pretty minor, and I really enjoyed the game overall. Number 4, Stray. Released in July for PlayStation and PC, Blue 12 Studios' debut game about a cat lost in a cyberpunk city was the subject of a viral marketing campaign that excited humans and cats alike. Stray was obviously the awards darling this year with 6 nominations, ultimately winning Best Indie Game and Best Debut Indie Game, which is kind of a strange overlapping category. It was also nominated for Straight Up Game of the Year, which is the biggest tip-off that it was going to win Best Indie Game. This has happened on 3 other occasions, with Inside, Celeste, and Hades, and all 3 went on to win Best Indie Game, so no shockers here. Stray is about a cat that teams up with a robot drone called B-12 and attempts to escape a massive enclosed city. The pair are aided by friendly robots that reside in the city and occasionally harassed by blobby little flesh eaters called Zurks. I really like the music and the world, and in particular all the neon lighting, but my overriding opinion of Stray is that the gameplay is not very fun. Now, if you love this game, I think that's great, and you should leave a comment explaining why you love it. But I have a sneaking suspicion that this game is 90% carried by having a cat for a protagonist. And for the record, I have nothing against that premise. I like cats. I have a cat. Here's a picture of my cat. But I've taken my major complaints about Stray and organized them into a numbered list. So here you go. Number 1. The gameplay and the story feel a bit at odds with the world and the core premise. By which I mean that being a cat in a cyberpunk playground makes me want to run around and explore, which you kinda can, especially in the beginning, but the story sort of railroads you into doing things exactly in order, in very specific ways, which in my opinion hurts the fun a little bit. This game is very linear, which is okay, especially when you want to tell a curated story, but the story was not blowing my mind, and the linearity kinda clashes with being a cat. Definitely my cat is not predisposed to complete world-saving missions so single-mindedly. Number 2. The contextual jump button. Apparently at one point in development, you could freely platform around, but this led to a lot of falls, which didn't feel very cat-like. So the devs implemented a contextual jump button that appears when you're in range of a jumping opportunity. And I get that choice, but it leads to a lot of moments where I know I should be able to jump, but I'm not standing in quite the right spot, so I had to fidget awkwardly around until the button showed up. Or moments when I assumed you just couldn't jump up certain ledges because the jump button never appeared where I was standing. It's always frustrating when controls get in the way, and I'm still salty about it. Number 3. The puzzles and the pacing are frustrating. This is just my experience, but it felt like most of the times I encountered a puzzle or an obstacle in the game, the solution was fairly obvious, but executing that solution was tedious and time-consuming. Way too many times you're about to make meaningful progress and the game is like, just kidding, go do this first. And sometimes I was so far down a rabbit trail I forgot what was actually happening in the story. At one point you're hunting for detergent you can trade for an electric wire, that you trade for a sweater, that you can give to a guy who will fix a tracker for you, so you can give it to another guy and that guy can tell you where to go with it. And then you get to go there with it. It also feels like a lot of the puzzles and obstacles were a bit repetitive. After the first third of the game, it felt like I was doing a lot of the same things over and over again, which made the end of the game kind of drag for me. Number 4. There's a segment of the game where you get loaded up with a UV light-based weapon called a defluxer that lets you turn the tables on the Zurks you've thus far been avoiding through stealth and speed.
If we could somehow harness this light, channel it into the flux capacitor.
This should be super fun, but instead it's the most tedious part of the game. You can fire the defluxer for about 3 seconds before it overheats and goes on cooldown for another 5 seconds, which means you'll crawl forward, zap a few enemies, and then run away and wait for the defluxer to recharge. Like 100 times. Maybe the devs intended players to do a bit more running and gunning, but it seems like one of those things where they should have noticed in playtesting that players tended to approach this segment in a cautious and extremely boring way. I don't know, did you do this differently? Let me know. Those are my biggest complaints, and as I said, they are essentially all gameplay complaints. I did really enjoy the environments and the character design and the central premise. And yes, it was fun to scratch the carpets and meow and curl up in a corner and climb over rooftops. I thought the lighting effects were really cool, and the story was fine. There were a few good moments, but nothing I didn't see coming. The end is actually very good, and almost tricked me into thinking that the story was better than it was, which I mean as a compliment. Overall, it's a solid game that I suspect most will enjoy for the visuals and the cat factor. But as a game, I found it somewhat tedious and frustrating. The last nominee is Cult of the Lamb, which came out for all platforms in August. Cult of the Lamb is about exactly that. A sacrificial lamb is revived by an ancient demon and goes about running a cult and getting revenge on the demon's behalf. Let me start by saying I had fun with this one, and if you did too, that's awesome. However, I am absolutely mystified that this game was nominated for an award. That's not to say it's a bad game, per se, but if I'm being totally honest, I think its popularity is mostly attributable to the core conceit of adorable woodland critters in a demonic cult.
This is cause for celebration. Let's sacrifice rabbit and eat his flesh. Yay, sacrifice me to the devil! Yay, yay!
That's a cute idea, but unfortunately the gameplay in this one is kind of forgettable. Half the game is a little city management sim, and the other half is about doing roguelike combat runs called Crusades. Despite the game pretending otherwise, these two aspects have little to do with each other and don't often interact. I personally enjoyed managing the cult more than doing combat runs, but unfortunately this game falls victim to the pitfall of having lots of interesting sounding systems that you don't actually have to engage with. Like for instance, all of your followers have little traits like sloth or coprophilia that affect their loyalty and work rate, but I found myself largely ignoring these traits because absolutely nothing about this game demands that level of micromanagement. Also, here's an annoying thing. Your cult has a little belief tech tree, where you get to choose between two beliefs whenever you declare new doctrines. But like half the time, I felt like I had to choose between the funny option I wanted to pick and the option that was actually good for my game. By the end of the game, I was mostly on autopilot with the cult, and spending my energies on finishing the combat sections. So let's talk about those. I know this game didn't market itself as a combat game first and foremost, but the combat runs are kind of just bad. There isn't much variation in the weapons. The enemies are all kind of samey, and you basically just dodge and hit on repeat. Also, while I like the flat, storybook Paper Mario aesthetic, it makes some of the hitboxes a little weird and deceptive. And maybe this is my fault for playing on the Switch, but my experience was riddled with performance issues. Tons of frame rate drops and stutter during combat, a few outright crashes, and, somewhat comedically, the game soft-locked when I had two brothers fight each other to the death in ritual combat. However, my biggest complaint about Cult of the Lamb is that it's just way too long. While I enjoyed the first 6 hours or so, I was really trudging along by the end, and that's unfortunate because it makes me look back on the game a lot less fondly. Also, there is an okay story here, but it's a bit predictable, not too impactful on the gameplay, and I would not classify this as a story game. Basically, Cult of the Lamb is a game that remixes a few tried and true game mechanics into a decently fun package, and slaps on an amusing premise, but it doesn't really excel in any individual aspect. But like I said, I did for the most part enjoy playing the game, and I'll end on a few positives. I do really like the art style. Some of the writing and cult mechanics are actually pretty funny, and I'm into this dice-chucking minigame Knucklebones. It's pretty good. So that's all the nominees. Obviously, Stray came out on top at the Game Awards, which I think everyone saw coming a mile away, but that doesn't mean it has to come out on top of my ranking. Here's how I'm personally ranking these 5. Cult of the Lamb has to be number 5, for the simple reason that I just won't be thinking about it at all this time next year. Sorry, Cult of the Lamb, it's been real. It's been fun, but it hasn't been real fun. Number 4, Stray. I respect the visual design. The ending is good, and it's fun to zoom around the environments, meowing your feline head off, but it's just too tedious and linear and formulaic for my taste. I do think it's more creative and more memorable than Cult of the Lamb, and I'm not mad I played it, but I will probably never revisit it. My second and third favorites are not far apart, but I think I'll put Neon White in third place. I had a lot of fun with the speedrunning and perfecting all the runs, and I think it's arguably the most unique of all the nominees. It's one of those games that gives you a real feeling of mastery as it goes on, and I like that. In second place, Sifu. I think Sifu delivered exactly what it promised, which was basically a kung fu flick in video game form. This game never misses a chance to throw in little touches here and there that just make you smile, and even if you end up doing some of the stages quite a few times, I felt like the pacing of Sifu was overall pretty good, and I never lost interest during my playthrough. That means my number 1 pick is Tunic. I genuinely love Tunic, and it captures a lot of things I love about video games in general. It's the only one of these 5 that I know I'll come back to, keep recommending, and still be thinking about in the future. But hey, that's just my opinion, and there's fun to be had with all these games. Let me know in the comments which of these games you liked best, or drop a ranking of all 5. How do you feel about Stray winning? If you want to support the channel, leave a like and subscribe, or check out some of the other videos on here. I really do appreciate everyone watching and commenting on these videos, so thanks again. There will be more content soon, so I'll see you in the next one.